name is Roger Davis. I was with the United States Air Force from 61 to 65 and spent most of that time in Berlin. When the wall was built, I was there and stayed for approximately 3 more years.
Roger, what year did you join the Air Force?
February 9th, 1961.
And where were you living at the time?
Actually, California. I'd gone out to California in the Bay Area and decided to enlist.
Did you ever grow up in the Midwest, or did you grow
Oh
up?
yeah, I had gone to high school at St. Louis Park in Minnesota, and had gone to college at St. Cloud University for a while, for a year.
How'd you end up in California?
Buddy and I decided to just take a road trip and ran out of money.
And that was the enticement to join the Air Force?
Actually, it was my ex-girlfriend in California's boyfriend who decided that it'd be a good idea if I joined the Air Force. He was in the Air Force.
That sounds like a separate story.
It was a separate story.
We won't go there. Yeah. All right, you joined the Air Force, and where did you end up for basic training?
Basic training, Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and did pretty well on my test scores. And they gave me an opportunity to choose, and I chose language school at Monterey, California. And while waiting to get into the slot to go there, the guy in the processing center said, after 4 weeks of waiting, he says, "You know, I can make a cook out of you. Yeah, I have this other business I'd like to approach you to go into. And if you don't choose that, I'll make a cook out of you." And what it was Electronic Intelligence, Biloxi, Mississippi. And electronic intelligence is known as ELINT, Electronic Intelligence. So that's how I wound up in that business.
And you went to school where for that?
Biloxi.
Biloxi, you said, okay.
Yeah.
All right, now you're into a whole new
world.
Whole new world. And at some point, you leave the States to go. When do you leave and where do you go?
The training at Biloxi lasted for, it was a crammed up course. I mean, it was supposed to be 26 weeks and they ran us through in about 14 weeks. And then I was assigned to Berlin and gotten into Germany, I think on the 6th of August, into Berlin. A couple of days later, I stopped and met with my brother-in-law out in the zone. And at that time, Berlin was an occupied city. It was occupied by the United States military and the Russians and the French and the British. There were separate zones. And so it was into Berlin on the 6th of August. 13th of August, the wall went up.
Wow, that close.
That close.
Now, when the wall went up, we'll look at pictures of it later. It looked like it was a pretty short wall at the time.
Yeah, it really was. It was a piece of junk when it went up. It would be as if you and I, they decided to make masons out of us, and we'd never seen a trowel before in our lives. And they started throwing it up on, it was a late Sunday night, Monday morning kind of adventure. And I got rousted out. I was stationed at Tempelhof Airport, which was a former military airport for the German Luftwaffe during World War II. And we went down to the wall that night, and in the floodlights, they were slopping up blocks, and I don't know how else to describe it. It was just a piece of junk that was about probably 6 feet tall, with a couple of strands of barbed wire on the top, and lots of glaring lights and lots of yelling and screaming and shooting, and it was kind of wild.
Now, at the time, your job function was what in the electronic intelligence?
At that time, I was an electronic intercept person. My job was to monitor electronic transmissions, primarily Russian radars. and that was more or less my own specialty.
Okay. At some point, you wandered into a facility that had a large map showing targets in
Yeah.
Russia. How did this come about? How did you stumble
Well,
into this?
that was much later in my career.
Okay.
I wound up at Roswell, New Mexico, to finish out. You have tours, if you still have 8 months left on your service at that time, I was 4-year enlistee, you would wind up being assigned somewhere. Well, with my training at Biloxi and then into Berlin for 33 months, I think. And then I came out and they have to reassign you someplace or discharge you. Well, they decided to assign me to Roswell Air Force Base, which was the 509th, the ones that dropped the atomic bombs during World War II, the only unit that's ever dropped them. And so I worked in combat intelligence there, which was the briefing of crews on how to penetrate the Soviet air defense systems. And that was interesting duty too. It gave me a second type of top secret clearance. My first top secret clearance, what is known as code word clearance, and that came out of the fact that our group in Berlin was all assigned to NSA, the National Security Agency. At that time, the National Security Agency was a classified term. I mean, you actually had to have a clearance to know that NSA existed. And NSA, when people begin to see the initials, our response was no such agency. That's what NSA stood for. Had a budget of probably 10 times the CIA, and nobody had ever heard of it.
Now, you mentioned Roswell. Is that the famous site for Area 51?
Yes. Well, no, 51's in Nevada.
Oh, okay. All right.
But that's where the Roswell alien
Story.
story.
Okay. Now, you said there were 2 types of top secret clearances. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, yes. The other one is a SIOP clearance, SIOP, and that stands for Single Integrated Operations Plan, and that's what the Big Bang was. That's the war plan. At that time, I was there in '64, we had assigned, I think, 608 B-52s on a first strike basis to the Soviet Union. And SIOP was what that plan was called. Targets all over Soviet Union and their bases.
Whose job was it to pick the targets? Was it a group?
Yeah, the targets were not picked by us at Roswell. We had 2 wings of B-52s, which is about 20 aircraft total, 16 all committed to the war plan. But those were picked by a higher pay grade.
Did you ever get a chance to see the targeting map?
Oh, sure, yeah,
How'd
all
that
the
happen?
time. Worked on them all the time.
So you knew where all the targets were?
Yes. And in most cases, in one particular set of circumstances, the captain that I worked for had to be out of town. Project Blue Book was when people saw aliens, Blue Book, he'd have to go out and interview people about that. And it's a whole separate story, but we got a message that said, we'd like to know if there's a conflict between all the weapons that were going off in the Soviet Union over a very short period of time, 12-hour.
You mean our weapons, you mean?
Our weapons,
Okay.
the Brits,
Yeah.
the French, anybody who had a piece of the war plan. And he left the office and he says, here, go out and figure this out. 15th Air Force wants to know if we have conflict. In other words, would our own aircraft be knocked out by our own weapons going off? And you have to understand the magnitude at that time. We were on the order of over 11,000 weapons going off in the Soviet Union in the first 12 hours. That's just incomprehensible. And so what I did, I put 3 separate classified top secret PSYOP books together and was able to look at where all of the weapons would be going off and at what time. We have a time frame on this is X hour in X plus 22 or X plus 6 hours or X plus 3 hours, depending on the delivery systems. Some of them were from submarines, some of them were from aircraft out of Europe. Some of them were Atlas missiles and Titan missiles coming out of the United States. Minuteman missiles, for instance, would arrive a lot sooner than the bombers would start arriving. Our normal flight time to the line, there's a line drawn across outside the Soviet Union, and everybody was supposed to time themselves in their flights and their routes to arrive on that line all the way around the Soviet Union at a specific time. So on one sweep of a radar, you saw nothing, and the next sweep you saw 1,500 aircraft coming towards you. And so it was very well timed.
Did you ever find any faults in the timing?
Oh yeah, I mean, when the Captain Mack, who later died in Vietnam, when he assigned me to look at that issue, I found that 15 out of 16 of our flights were knocked out before they got to the target by our own weapons. And that was the first time that SAC knew we had a problem. I mean, it was, when he got back and he looked at it and he said, show me how you did this. And I had a map of the Soviet Union that was as big as a wall in this room. And I would run the route charts, which are 50 miles either side of the flight track, and I'd run them through, and I devised a system where I marked up on plastic overlays and could actually tell you in 15 minutes how many times you were going to get knocked out of the air before you got your target. And that was the first time that SAC, it sounds kind of strange, but it was the first time that SAC really figured out we might be blowing up our own airplanes on the way in. And so I wound up doing a lot of work in the next few days to amend the routes and try to change the timing so that we would not be knocking off our own. But I can imagine, I know when Captain Mack asked me to do the briefing because I had figured it out, and he'd been basically off chasing aliens, and he says, oh, you tell the crews, because we would assemble our crews for briefings. So you'd have 500-600 men sitting out there, the crews for 16 B-52s, 6 per aircraft. And I can remember calling out crew 13. I said, this is your lucky day. You at least get to the target. Everybody else in this room dies on the way in. And I mean, there was a hush in the crowd. Usually they're pretty rambunctious bunch of guys. And there was just a hush, and they all were committed to go, but not with the thought that they were all going to die of their own weaponry. And it was pretty shocking.
How long did it take for this now to be fixed or changed so it wouldn't happen?
It was interesting. Probably 3 or 4 days later, I had never met a general before. Well, I guess I had in Berlin, but I had a general come in, and he was all huffy-puffy, and the base commander's there, and I'm a lonely enlisted man, you know, and it was kind of like, okay, Raj, this is your show. And so I demonstrated the technique that I had used and described what I had done with the 3 books. One of them gave timing, one of them gave size of weapon, who was delivering the weapon, and and where it was going. Well, and I described how I'd gone through that process in order to put the marks on the plastic map overlay. And he sat there and he watched me do it, probably for 15 minutes. I'd done 2 routes. And he said, where have you been working on this? And I said, right here in this briefing room. And he turned to the rest of the people, were all very high-ranking officers. I mean, colonels and up, and with the exception of Captain Mack, my boss, and then of course me. And he said, do you know what this airman has done? He's got the whole blank, 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 bleep it out, war plan in one place at one time, and I want him from this point on working inside a safe. We actually had safes that were big enough that you could walk into them and do stuff. And I want an armed guard outside the door the whole time. And then he congratulated me on figuring it out, and later I found out that they were able to computerize it. And I had worked up just a system that worked. And so it was, pretty tense, because for the next 2 weeks, we did nothing but work on our timing to try to avoid what we call conflicts. And in the chaos of what would have happened, you'd have B-52s, some of them arriving wounded, some of them arriving not with all their engines functioning, and everything. It would have been chaos. The timing never would have worked anyway. I mean, the whole idea was to be able to tell our pilots that at a certain time, 27 degrees off your bow, your heading, you're going to have a weapon go off that's 20 megatons. And you don't want to be blinded by it. And of course, it would have been total chaos.
So if the nuclear bomb would have went off at
Yeah,
the same time.
almost all of the nuclear targeting weapons were set for airburst. You get a much better destruction of the targets with an airburst. And so they'd explode them 5, 6, 4,000, 3,000 feet, depending on size of the weapon, above the earth.
And if the B-52 was in the area, it would take the
Within,
B-52.
if you're within, if a B-52, see, the plan called for at that time what we called a high-low approach. They'd come in high, drop down on the deck. And when I mean on the deck, when they used to practice, sometimes they'd come back with hay in their intakes. They really prided themselves on being able to, on practice stuff, be able to be the lowest bomber in the fleet, And so they, the pilots again, the crews were all very dedicated people. I mean, they knew the score. And our routes came in from the northwest and ran to the northeast corners of the Soviet Union, all over the Soviet Union, but most of them had an exit point through the Caspian Sea at that time. And you wonder why we were so attached to the Iranian government, why we were giving them, the Iranians at that time were getting first-line fighters, F-14s, and really high-quality aircraft were going to the Shah. And that's because we had recovery bases set up in Iran where they were supposed to, we were asking the Iranians to, in effect, protect our B-52s while we recovered them, gassed them, and got them out of Dodge. And of our 16, like I say, only one would have survived even to the target, his last target, due to all the weaponry going off. I think that was the beginning of the the understanding that we'd really over-targeted, we could probably cut back on the number of weapons being delivered, and get the treaties to go along with that. But you can't imagine what 11,600 and some odd nuclear weapons are going off on a first strike, no look basis. In other words, no reconnaissance to see if we got them with the first one. There were many targets that were being hit 5, 6 times.
You talked about a town, I can't remember the name of it, where there was a building on or over the river. Water coming in was fresh and going out hot, meaning radioactive.
Yeah.
What was that about? Where was it, first of all?
Well, there were a number of targets, particularly north and west of Moscow, and in the area between some of the names, some of the towns, but at any rate, what you had, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and there are a lot of lakes in there, a lot of reservoirs. And I know as I was looking at the mapping, as I worked on that project, looking at the mapping, I couldn't figure out, I wonder what the target is. I mean, usually the data would not necessarily, unless I really dug into it, tell me what the actual target was. And in this particular case, we were hitting reservoirs. That was the target. So that if you put a nuclear weapon of even 3 or 6 megatons into a reservoir, you'll pop the dam. And if that happens, all the water going downstream is hot. It's radioactive. It's a flood, and it's Mount St. Helena 50 times over.
Wow.
And so you had towns that you wouldn't necessarily have to hit the next town down or a base or anything like that. All the bridges were going to be knocked out by hot radioactive water.
Now, just because of the heavy flow, nothing to do with the
Well,
radiation.
if you pop the dam,
Yeah.
all the water that's behind the reservoir is going to come downstream, and it's going to be not only just the water, but the radioactivity of the water.
From the nuke. But there was a building over the river where something was being assembled, and it was
Oh yeah,
coming in.
one of our targets was Petropavlovsk, which is a city out in it's south and east of Moscow, quite a ways, about 600-800 miles, I suppose. And I looked at that. Petropavlovsk was one of our targets, but that's a submarine base out on the Kamchatka Peninsula. But another town by the name of Chelyabinsk was a nuclear assembly plant. And it was supposedly, and I've seen newsreels or programming on television where they talk about it now as being a super secret base. Well, it was anything but super secret to us. Did I just lose my mic? But
No, you're okay.
Okay. It was a weapons assembly area, and we were able to locate it by the fact that the river running through the town was radioactive. And we just followed the radioactivity back upstream until we located what amounted to their primary weapons assembly
Now,
plant.
are you talking about our spies in Russia doing this?
Most of that was accomplished by the U-2 program,
Okay.
and it was detectable from the air, I'll put it that way. It was and I just looked at it and I saw, why are we hitting this little bitty town way out in the middle of nowhere with 7 targeted nuclear weapons? And because 7 was a high number,
Yeah.
they wanted to make sure they got it.
Because
so-
something was being assembled. Did anybody ever find out what was it the bombs being assembled?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The Russians needed an assembly facility, just like we needed them, and that's where they chose to put it, Chelyabinsk. So,
Before we get into the U-2 conversation,
yeah.
is there anything else we should be talking about when it comes to targeting back in the Cold War days? Anything unusual?
Just an incredible number. I know that as I begin to assemble on a map,
Yeah.
using symbols and color and numbers and alphabetic numbers, and it was just an incredible blanketing of the entire Soviet Union. Even if only half of the weapons detonated, and we actually figured that 90% of them would detonate, it would have been the end of the world as we know it. I mean,
Yeah. Well, if they saw them coming, they would return fire, but perhaps before the missiles or bombers got to the site.
well,
There's a chance that they would see it coming and say, hey, we got to do something.
there's not a lot you can do about a ballistic missile on the way in. I mean,
But they could return fire when they saw it coming.
oh, they certainly would.
So
I
it
mean,
would have
this was
been-
an all-out launch situation.
It was-
This is what Jack Kennedy talked about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he said that any attack literally generating out of Cuba would mean a full-scale response from our side and a full-scale nuclear exchange. They'd have launched their stuff, and some of their stuff was really, really dirty. I mean, and big. I mean, they had some massive nukes that they used to test them at on an island north of St. Petersburg and to the east. And they tested one nuclear weapon up there that we rated at like 57 megatons. Our B-52s carried our biggest stuff at 20. A weapon of that size going off over the state of Pennsylvania would have taken out the entire state of Pennsylvania.
Did they have a delivery system for that?
Oh, yeah.
Was it rockets or plane?
I don't know. I wasn't
Well,
privileged to that.
in the case of Kennedy, I don't know if I heard it from you that we knew about the Cuban missiles before they got there.
That's true.
Now let's back up. We
Okay.
had a Soviet general who was our guy.
Yeah.
What's the story on that?
When I was in Berlin, we were getting data that was in such detail that those of us who thought about it knew that we had to have somebody on the inside. I mean, we were getting corrections on some stuff down to the last digit of 6 digits on a location, and so there was actually he was a colonel. His name was Penkovsky, and Oleg Penkovsky, and he was, and I did not know his name then. I mean, I found that out later when I went to Roswell. Part of my job was to read classified stuff, and he was feeding us. I've been told it was on the order of 10,000 documents that he smuggled out. Whenever you take that much out, somebody's going to figure it out. And they caught up with him, and they executed him. But Kennedy had that source available to him at the time. And that source was telling us that not only were there missiles going into Cuba, Scud 2s, we were getting the serial numbers. And I'm in Berlin wondering when the president's going to do something about it, because we're 110 miles behind the Iron Curtain. And and Berlin was part of the whole Cuban mess. It was Khrushchev trying to bully his way into getting us to abandon our position in Berlin. and he did a lot of things that, put us on edge. We moved in 2 full armored divisions of over 60,000 troops and surrounded Berlin with these, and then said, get out. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was just another part of that bullying process. And anyway, Pinkowski was feeding us data, and I keep wondering when our present administration, the Kennedy administration, is going to react to this. We know that there are 20 plus Scuds going into Scud missiles, nuclear armed, going into Cuba, and we aren't reacting to it at all.
You knew about this before the
Before.
U-2, so the U-2 aerial photography was the facade.
No, what happened actually, what I'm told happened.
Oh,
I had no part of that part of the operation. The Air Force, in conjunction with General LeMay, who was head of SAC at that time, Strategic Air Command, basically on his own authorized the flight of U-2s, Air Force U-2s, over Cuba, and then took the pictures to Kennedy and said, this is what's going on. And with that, Kennedy then authorized some CIA flights of their U-2s. They each have their own U-2s. And sure enough, what you then got was the clear picture of sites being developed. And we lost an Air Force pilot, a U-2 pilot during that. Most people forget about it, but a Major Anderson was knocked down, and in his U-2 over on one of the overflights. And there were a lot of us who were not happy with that situation.
Somebody said, maybe it was you, that we followed the missiles coming from Russia through the ocean going to Cuba, so we knew about it before it got there.
Yeah, well, there's the whole Cuban Missile Crisis has been documented so many different times, but our photo recon people were photographing the ships carrying them, and of course they then declared the blockade of Cuba, and that's when the whole crisis got real hairy. And I saw a possible way out of our predicament I'm still in Berlin when that's happening, and believe me, they put us on all kinds of alert status. We had explosives on top of our equipment during the Cuban Missile Crisis because, again, we're 110 miles behind the Iron Curtain, and we did not want our equipment or what we did in Berlin to be compromised. So we sat there at our receivers we looked like pirates. I mean, I had 2 bandoliers of carbine ammunition across my chest, my carbine sitting propped up against my receiver, and explosives on the equipment, prepared to shoot our way out of Berlin.
Well, as long as we're talking about U-2,
Yeah.
let's go into the famous Gary Francis Powers
Yeah.
story. He took off someplace in Turkey.
No.
No?
He was assigned initially to Turkey, but he took off from a base called Peshawar up in
where?
northern Pakistan.
Oh,
And his mission was to fly at maximum altitude, which no one has ever, in any of the unclassified documents that I've seen, have ever got his altitude right. He flew higher than they said, and higher than he commented in his trial when he was shot down later over Sverdlovsk. I later, when I got to Roswell, I read, as again, part of my job was to sift through intelligence to see what we could share with our air crews that might help them survive. He was shot down at about 68,000 feet, which is well below his operating altitude. He had claimed in his classified debriefing that when we got him back, that he had lost engine, he flamed out and was descending to a lower altitude to be restart.
Now he flamed out because he ran out of oxygen?
Well,
Or
the
something?
U-2 is a very delicate, operates in a very delicate altitude. He was flying, the normal U-2 flights are made at 80,000 feet. And assuming, and he says he was up there, he had a flame out, he was descending to where he could get into more oxygen-rich air. And when he was knocked down by a SA-2 surface-to-air missile. And it was a newer version of the SA-2. We had seen him in Berlin, and I was very familiar with him from my experiences in Berlin. But he came down in kind of a flat spin, and he claimed that he got kind of sucked out of the aircraft and couldn't get back in to hit the demolition switch. And the demo switch, I later met some U-2 pilots. In fact, in Roswell, that's who I worked for, was a U-2 pilot. And none of the pilots believed that what they were told. What they were told was there's a 45-second delay. When you hit that toggle switch to destruct the aircraft, there's a 45-second delay. And none of them believed it. And they had good reason probably not to believe it. They were issued a needle in a silver dollar to kill themselves with. And so it was obvious that there was no desire that the pilot survive. And so anyway, he did not hit the destruct switch, and the U-2 came down pretty much intact in terms of what was on the aircraft. I mean, all the cameras and sensory equipment and everything was built into the fuselage. The wings kind of came apart, but it came down pretty soft. Didn't plow in.
So that's why Khrushchev was able to show the camera, the lens,
Everything.
the film, and whatever.
We had to assume when that thing went down that everything was compromised on that aircraft. And so it was fate, or interesting to me anyway. I got a tremendous break in seeing a piece of history. Gary Powers was traded back to us a couple of years later. The movie that's out right now, Bridge of Spies, kind of condenses the whole story. So you don't get a sense of understanding that a couple of years actually went by before we got him back. And I was in Berlin at that time, and on my intercom, sergeant out front said, Davis, report to the armory, special detail. And so I was part of the protection team for Powers. Once we got him back, we wanted him to go out in safety. And so they had about 6 of us that surrounded him. We were armed, and surrounded us and him, and walked him out to the airplane, and we flew him out of Tempelhof. And in the movie, I saw the movie with Gene the other night, and it was kind of, I'm wondering what's my role. And I leaned over and I said to her, if Gary Powers, in the movie here version, if he has a Russian winter hat on, then they got the detail right. And sure enough, when they show up, he had the hat on. What people don't realize is there was a big time rift between the CIA and Gary Powers at that point in time. And when Powers, and I'm standing as close to him as I am to you, he went out in handcuffs. That's how big the rift was. In the movie, they just show it as, well, the CIA guy doesn't want to talk to him much, and he's kind of showing his displeasure with him. They were more than displeased with him. They were, they took him out in handcuffs. And
But didn't he later get a bunch of medals for what he did at one time?
you know, I don't know. I
saw
heard
something
that.
like that, yeah.
Of course, they cashiered him out, and he eventually, a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years after they got him back at Glen Necker Bridge in Berlin, he was flying helicopters for a news service and died in an accident. But
Well,
he wasn't loved.
no. I can't appreciate what he went through.
Yeah.
I mean, they wanted him to kill himself, and he didn't do it, or destroy the airplane, more importantly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's a
He
history.
embarrassed a president. You're not supposed to do that.
Eisenhower was president,
Yeah.
wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Armageddon almost happened twice. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Government officials were sending their families back to their home state
Oh, yeah.
to get out of Washington. I was in the Army at the time. I was at Fort Monmouth, and they had us pack up all our bags to go down to Florida.
Yep.
And I don't know where in Florida, we never went. We lived out of a duffel bag for a week or two, I can't remember. So I stayed in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey.
Yeah. I know that just before the crisis, as a kind of an afterthought, I was in Berlin and get called downstairs, the administration stuff, and they said, we see your records show that you've been trained in Spanish. And yeah, I'd taken a quarter course in high school in Spanish. And I said, but I don't have very good Spanish. And they said, well, we want to test you because we may want to send you down to Florida, same as your situation. And of course, whenever they talk to you like that, they also are shooting needles in your shoulder for every disease you've ever heard of. And so it was like, here, go get your shots and report down. And they had me listen to some tapes of Cuban Missile Control people, and I was supposed to then translate it. Well, I flunked it big time, in my Spanish, let alone the technology words that you wouldn't normally hear. So I didn't get out of Berlin to go to Florida, but some people did. The group we had in Berlin was a mixed bag. We called it interactive package group. We had linguists from probably 7 or 8 different countries, a lot of them. I mean, our group probably had 300 or 400 linguists. We had ELINT, people like myself who were trained in electronic surveillance, and we probably had close to 100 of those. And then we had what we called diddy-bop chasers, which essentially monitored Morse code and recorded that. And then we had Radiant, which is radar intelligence. We had a huge search radar located on one of the buildings in Tempelhof. Is a huge, massive structure. I was told at the time it was the second largest building in the world. And so we would all work together on the monitoring of what was going on out in the East German, Russian, Polish skies, Czechoslovakian skies also then. But so it when the Russians described Berlin as a nest of American spies, they pretty much had it right.
What building is this and where is it?
This is on Potsdamer Platz in Berlin. It's on the western side of the wall. The building was interesting to me because initially some of the other photographs that I have show it in total disrepair. And when Gene and I visited Berlin a couple of years ago, we discovered this building had been converted from the old Gestapo headquarters to today an art museum. And it is a real piece of history. I first got involved in the building itself in probably the spring of '62. I started going into the building and was scouting the building in its disrepaired state for passages. There are tunnels all over that area. And I found some that were leading into East Germany, and that later became for us, a source of entry into East Berlin. We didn't do it, but an Army intelligence unit went in there. This is what the wall looked like when it first went up. It was a piece of junk. We could have punched through it with a Jeep at any given point. And then later, of course, it was fortified to make it quite formidable. But you can see guard tower shooting stations all over the place. Okay, the wall went up in stages. This would probably be late '62 or late '60. Yeah, it. You can see they've reinforced it with tank barriers and also with more wire, and they continually modified it. It ran right through the heart of the city. There are places in the city where the wall was just simply boarded up buildings and mortared up windows. A good example of that would be Bernauer Strasse, where people literally made escapes from 3 stories up. But there were, it didn't all go up at one time. These Germans created shooting strips, or vacant space in between the wall and the inner wall and the outer wall. And they would have these areas where they would typically either run dogs in them or sometimes had sand, but all times they had shooting towers. And just like we set up deer stands in northern Minnesota, they would set up stands and were not afraid to shoot. Okay, the division of families was one of the heartbreaking things. I'm kind of a sketch artist, and I used to sketch families on one side of the wall holding up their kids for graduation or baptisms and things like that. And it was heartbreaking during those years to see the division of families that was caught up in the wall. This is the same building. It's hard to believe, as I pointed out earlier, which they turned into an art museum. It's a Gestapo headquarters. And it was still pretty much bombed out, as you can see. And I used to crawl around in it. And at one point in time, I spoke to my brother-in-law, who was in Army intelligence, and I said to him, I've found some tunnels that run under this building that run into the east. And he later advised me, and I met with some of the people that would work those tunnels and go infiltrate in and out of East Germany through this building. But it was right on the wall. Before the wall existed, you can see in the lower part of this picture, it's hard to focus on it, but there was just a line on the street that said, this is the, well, vous sortez du secteur américain, you are now leaving the American sector. And it said that in English, and it said that in Russian, and it said that in French. And so when they built the wall, these signs were still up. And before, they were just advisory signs for people moving through East Germany and West Berlin and East Berlin. But this particular one was shot from one of the windows. I took this photograph from one of the windows of what later was Gestapo headquarters. This was the typical signage that you had all over Berlin. This particular one was in the American sector, but showing directions how to get to wherever. Checkpoint Charlie, of course, became famous and over the years, but in the beginning, all it was a sign. And this was probably taken 2 or 3 days after the wall initially began to be built. And people standing around gawking at it. And
Now it's a museum.
now it's a museum. There's a museum right at the corner. This myself on the left and my buddy Chuck Patton on the right. And every once in a while they'd arm us and give us our helmets and carbines and ammunition. And I sat through the movie GI Blues with a submachine gun in my lap, so I guess we were serious. This is the remains of the Reichstag, and you see the Hitler's bunker was just off to the left of this, but that's what was left of it after the war, and they cleared all the other buildings from the area.
Is this the building where they had the big swastika on the roof and it was blown up? And
Yeah.
Same building.
It is. They've refurbished it today, and
But you see a lot of footage where there was a big swastika up here.
I don't.
the Russians blew it up.
Yeah. There were swastikas all over town, and they blew them up everywhere. In fact, they blew one up at Tempelhof while I was there.